From ELCA Advocacy, this is Here I Pod. There's so much happening in our communities every week and every day that are impacted by policies at the local, state, and federal levels. Here I Pod will focus on one aspect of what's happening each episode by talking with faith-based advocates, as well as providing steps that you can take in your own advocacy efforts. One of the most pressing aspects of the current shutdown of the U.S. federal government is its effect on SNAP and other hunger-related programs. The interviews you're about to hear were recorded on Monday, October 27th, as advocates across the country expected SNAP funding to run out or be withheld starting November 1st. Since this was recorded, SNAP benefits were not released on November 1st, and federal judges have issued court orders that the administration continue to fund SNAP through use of contingency funds. Here's Regina.
Seasoned listeners will recall that the One Big Beautiful Bill Act made sweeping changes to the nation's nutrition safety net. It slashed federal SNAP funding by $186 billion, expanded work requirements to include veterans and parents with older children, and shifted more of the administrative benefit costs onto states. Together, these changes are expected to push millions of Americans off the rolls entirely. Now, that already fragile system faces a new crisis. Because of the ongoing federal government shutdown, the U.S. Department of Agriculture has announced that no new SNAP benefits will be issued for November 2025. Funds have simply run out. Today, I'm speaking with Karen Ehrens, U.S. Policy Manager for the Alliance to End Hunger, a national coalition of nonprofits, faith-based organizations, for-profit organizations, and individuals committed to ending hunger through policy and partnership. The ELCA is a proud member of that alliance, both domestically and internationally, and together we're exploring what this moment means for hunger advocacy, faith, and justice. Karen, thank you so much for joining me today on such short notice.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's really good to talk with you, Regina, and to be able to help others know what's going on and maybe some things that they can do.
So, Karen, to start us off, can you give us a brief overview of the USDA's guidance that was just issued on Friday, October 24th? What exactly did the agency announce, and what does it mean for SNAP recipients going into November?
Yes, I'll start back just a little bit further, a few steps. On October 1st, our federal government entered a shutdown because Congress was not able to pass new funding legislation or temporary continuing resolution. Then, on October 10th, the USDA directed state agencies to delay sending their November SNAP processing information to companies that process SNAP benefits. The following week, it was reported that the Secretary of Agriculture stated that USDA would run out of funding for SNAP in November. And then this past Friday, on October 24th, they did send a memo to the state agencies who operate SNAP, telling them that the Food and Nutrition Service would be suspending all November 2025 benefit amounts until sufficient federal funding is provided. So, as it stands today, there could be 42 million people on very short notice who will not be able to access food benefits that they were counting on come Saturday, November 1st.
How unusual is a move like this? Halting all new SNAP benefits nationwide. Have we ever seen anything comparable to this before?
No, we've never seen anything like this before, even during the COVID pandemic, when operations on a lot of fronts were very bumpy and not working very well. During that time, our nation was able to come together and keep so many people from feeling the effects of hunger and disrupted food systems. Now, this is like a big disruption landing where in a system that is just set up to continue operating regularly in all states on a predictable basis.
The guidance uses some fairly technical language about funding exhaustion and administrative restrictions. How should advocates and the public understand what's really happening here? Like, how would you explain it to a lay person?
The thing about the timing of this is that the federal government just finished a fiscal year on September 30th. So the accounts of the federal programs were winding down, and typically then Congress would pass and put more funding into their accounts so they could start off the federal fiscal year on November 1st with their accounts having assets in them to be able to draw on. Because of the end of the fiscal year and no new appropriations passed, those accounts are sitting pretty empty right now. So there isn't funding to draw down on. However, the USDA within its purview does have access to other funding that was approved by Congress. There is a SNAP contingency fund that has about $6 billion in it right now. These funds come from 2 years prior. So most of the anti-hunger advocates and some legal scholars believe that USDA should be able to utilize those funds in this contingency during an emergency. The USDA is saying it doesn't meet emergency status, although 42 million people not being able to access money to help them buy food seems like an emergency to me. There are also other sources of funds in different pots within the USDA that could be accessed. And the USDA did access those to send to states to help cover their administrative funds so they could continue to run the SNAP program, the people and the time needed to do that. USDA, and we're very thankful as advocates that USDA did also identify funding to keep the WIC program going during the month of October. So there is some instance of USDA being able to identify and move funds over to the place where they'd be able to use, but somehow they've decided that they won't at this time for the SNAP program.
What immediate effects do you anticipate for low-income households if the funding delays persist late into November or through the end of the year?
It could be a very dire situation. This decision impacts those with the least the most, so that people with the very lowest incomes will be most impacted. I think if you're working a job or more than one job for your family, you might be working in a lower wage job, you probably don't have a lot of funds saved up. So that people probably don't have a lot in savings to be able to fall back on when the money they were expecting to help them purchase food doesn't show up in their accounts. On top of that, there are some other things that complicate this. For example, our seniors. The programs that run senior nutrition programs, like the home delivered meals and the community meals, in some instances, they've had to stop those in some places because of this lack of funding during the shutdown. And so if you're a senior on a fixed income, also you may not have a lot of reserves to draw on. Now you won't be able to access SNAP, and you may not be able to access those home delivered meals, which in addition to seniors also help provide food to people with disabilities. When it comes to very young children, they also could be impacted because come November 1st, Head Start programs, some of those are having to shut down as well. In addition to education and socialization, Head Start programs also provide meals and snacks to children and families with the lowest of incomes. So you can kind of see this adding effect, and that people are being impacted in more than one place by the decisions and the fallout from the shutdown.
That is sobering, sobering context. Let's move a little into the policy and strategy. What advocacy actions is the Alliance coordinating at the federal level and maybe even at the state and local level to push for the restoration of SNAP funding?
Yes, we are encouraging, we are strongly urging the USDA to continue federal nutrition programs operating uninterrupted. So we are reaching out to the offices and members of Congress. We are trying to reach out to the administration to let them know how important these programs are and what the impacts on people and their communities will be. All of our partners have their own networks. So not only in the ELCA community, we know that you are connected through many congregations throughout the United States. We encourage you to reach out to members of Congress. We have members of our organization in the university settings who have networks. We have businesses that help administer the SNAP programs. So we're all urging them to weigh in to members of Congress and the administration to not let this happen.
Karen, what has been the response? What has been the response? Like, is anybody listening to us when we advocate?
Yes, we're hearing that the message is getting out. So, for example, members of Congress have also sent letters to the USDA urging them not to let this happen. Also, even the chair of the Senate Appropriations Committee, Susan Collins from Maine, also requested that USDA use legally available sources to fund SNAP, not only for the people in her state of Maine, but also for all the states. So we've heard that from many of our legislators, and they are also operating under shutdown. So there are some staff in congressional offices who may not be working or may not be working full force. Same thing with the administration. Some staff members are furloughed, but I would encourage people to, if they don't get a response or may not have been happy with what they heard, not to give up, but just keep being persistent and to try again. Like, even though I know sometimes people can feel like, oh, I don't want to nag them or something like that, just to keep trying to talk to your neighbors. So that's the advocacy front.
Today is Monday, October 27th. And so there's still time for Congress to turn the lights back on and not hit this cliff on November 1st. But assuming that we go over the cliff and there's program interruption, do you have any feeling for how quickly it would take to turn the spout back on once some kind of agreement is achieved?
It won't be immediate. These levers take a long time to turn back on again. In fact, it is likely that even if later this afternoon Congress said, okay, let's keep these going, here's some funding, benefits probably already will be at least late to come to people in states because they're multi-step processes going from the federal government to these SNAP electronic benefit card companies, then to the states, to people's accounts. So all of that which is now winding now down, would need to wind back up again. And so it will take a while once any type of green light moves forward.
Are there legislative mechanisms that could prevent this kind of benefit suspension from happening again?
The best thing would be for good governance, for regular order of Congress, for Congress to decide for itself that it's important to keep federal funding going to not just federal nutrition programs, but health programs and other nonprofit programs that help benefit people, that help our society run. And in order to do that, members from both sides of the aisle need to come together. They need to sit down at the table across from one another. They need to discuss and compromise. And it seems like we've gotten away from being able to accept compromises. But throughout time, compromise is what's needed to pass legislation.
Given that the Alliance is such a broad-based member organization, people and interests from across the spectrum, what role did the faith-based members of your Alliance play? And is there a particular role that churches and other faith-based organizations play in the Alliance generally and at this time in particular?
Yes, there is definitely a role. It's very ecumenical. I'm thinking back to just a few months ago when I was able to bring together this meeting on Capitol Hill with a member of Congress, and we had representation from Protestant group, Muslim group, and Jewish group all together, like standing in this circle in a hallway. And the synergy that came about from all of these different voices of faith coming together to speak up for very similar outcomes, like hoping to help make sure that people have enough to eat. It was just wonderful to be part of something like that. We feel that both secular and faith voices are very important. And of course, at this time, as people of faith tend to do, is to lift up prayers for the resolution to this problem, definitely needed there. But faith and action together take us just that much further.
So ELCA members are represented in the Alliance by our Capable Witness and Society staff, both domestically and internationally. But for our listeners who are listening throughout the nation, in congregations, in synods, what can they do between now and November 1st? And if the worst is to happen on November 1st, what can they do thereafter to help move the needle?
Yes, I would say we are so glad to have the ELCA as a member of the Alliance and grateful for this partnership. From now until November 1st, as I mentioned earlier, keep on ringing those bells. Pick up the phone, type into your computer, contact your members of Congress, and tell them how important this is, and to keep federal funding flowing to nutrition programs uninterrupted. After November 1st, or even maybe starting now, I know a lot of churches host food pantries or food shelves on their premises, or they partner with other organizations in their community. And if and when this does go through, there is going to be great need that will need to be met in our communities. More people will be turning to food pantries and soup kitchens. So as you can, help stock the shelves there, contribute funds, or volunteer within the organizations that you already have in place to help people have enough to eat. But we know that they're already seeing high need due to furloughed workers, to the high cost of food, due to inflation, and this will come on top of that. So it's a time for us to all pull together. Also, that senior neighbor down the street, check in on him or her, ask how they're doing. Do they need help? Do you have a neighbor with young children? Maybe ask them to come over for dinner, or take them a dinner at some time to help them. Purchasing a grocery card to help someone buy food somewhere. Those are all just some ideas that friends across the United States can do to help their neighbor.
Before we started recording, you were telling us a little bit about some of your Lutheran roots. So I want to ask you one final question here. Where have you seen the gospel recently in your work?
Oh gosh, that is a great question. My father was a baptized Lutheran, and my grandparents came to the United States from Norway, and they're buried in the cemetery of a small Lutheran church on the prairie in North Dakota. In my work, I have seen and experienced that faith by working with other faith-based partners like you, like Bread for the World, just people really coming together and saying, yes, we care, and yes, we're taking action. Even though we both talked about how dire the situation is, but also recognizing that there are glimmers of hope. There is evidence of people stepping forward, using their voices, using their hands, using their feet to help their neighbors in need.
Karen Ehrens, U.S. Policy Manager for the Alliance to End Hunger. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Regina. It's been a pleasure.
Regina also spoke to a core ELCA churchwide ministry leader to get a perspective on what we are and what we can do, as well as what it means to depend on common care.
Susannah, can you give your name and title and where you're coming to us from?
Hi, my name is Susannah Cunningham. I am the Senior Director from Building Resilient Community, which houses World Hunger, Lutheran Disaster Response, Amparo Forced Migration and Refugee Ministry, and finally, Education and Networks that works across our leadership on the ground in congregations and in synods.
If nothing changes between now and November 1st, policy experts are expecting for there to be significant concerns for feeding ministries across the country. Have you heard this? And have you heard about these changes in the One Big Beautiful Bill and the subsequent government shutdown? And what expectations do you have for feeding ministries across the ELCA?
So if nothing changes with regard to the big bill or the rescissions or the government shutdown, the impact that we are hearing on the ground is deep and grave concern around the inability to fill food shelves and storage and refrigerators that are currently empty in some of our food ministries that respond to vulnerable communities, families often who rely on those food pantries to make it to the end of the month. You know, the USDA, U.S. Department of Agriculture decision to no longer send inventories to food pantries along with funding cuts, is a double punch hit for people responding to extremely high inflation rates, higher utility bills, rent costs that all are being reported. You know, wherever you are across the US, you see discussions about affordability. It is a crisis in America that we're aware of. And so often food pantries and faith-based organizations that have social ministries that respond to poverty and hunger are front line. And where you see those food storage or those food pantries shelves empty, that's the canary in the coal mine. That's telling you that parents, families, people don't know how to make it to the end of the month. And if you've ever personally felt that fear, you know what it's like. And I think we are so often connected to people who have had that moment where they didn't understand where the next $300 would come from. You know, my sister used to say, I feel rich when I can pay my bills.
Mm.
And that fear around not being able to do that is something I'd love to spare any family. I'd love for them to focus on getting their kids into a sports team or a swim team or what's the exciting next thing. But when they're living in that fear, how that impacts the entire health of a family and of a community. And I think we're seeing that. We're seeing appeals from communities. We're seeing these empty storage from food pantries. We have a demand for our food pantry grants, our daily bread grants that far outstripes our ability to meet those. We have about a 30% ability to meet demand, which is not unacceptably low from the point of view from our team. I and our team members, I think, would cry tears of joy if we could figure out a way to meet that. And maybe we can talk about how we're trying to pivot to do that. But I'll just say the expectation from community is that if there is no relief, what do you do? And I'll just end to say this, that the work of World Hunger is not just about feeding people so they don't experience the pangs of hunger. It isn't just about sparing families' anxiety so that they can center on safety and love within their family and growth. To me, the work of making sure the food pantry shelves are full, that we can respond to this, has such extreme dividends on preventing people from falling off a fiscal cliff. Maybe you still eat, but you don't pay your credit card bills. And then you rack up credit card debt, and then you don't meet that debt, and the interest compounds, and that impacts your credit and your ability to get further credit. And there is this cascade effect that can happen to a family that can be generationally defining for that family, for their kids, for their grandparents. And if you can get in front of that, if you can prevent it by just taking care of one budget item, you can save someone from falling off that cliff that is 10x more expensive to pull them back from. And that's what I talk about when I want to make the logic case for someone who isn't compelled because you are my neighbor, because I love you, because you too are a child of God. And finally, the argument that I think we should be screaming from the mountaintops, which is, what better way to have confidence that someone will show up for you when you're down, when it's your darkest hour, than you show up for another person. And I think all of this, the logic, the morality, the way that it shows up for our neighbor, the way it makes us feel comforted to know what our future might be like around a blind turn, all of this arrives at the same conclusion, which is to try to help, to try to respond before people hit that precipice.
Susannah, is World Hunger or BRC issuing any practical guidance to food bank operators or feeding ministries about how to prepare for what may be coming if nothing changes between now and November 1st?
We know that there is a partner in Alaska that Alaska has had to respond to a disaster that's recently struck in the community. And that meant that a food bank and a shelter that would normally receive resources for the community they serve experiencing houselessness will not be receiving that, and it'll be redirected to the disaster. That is a good thing that the people experiencing this disaster get those resources. But that means that food bank, that shelter, isn't going to get the food it needs to serve its community, and there's no one else that's going to be able to respond. We're going to try to move within building resilient communities to respond. We have encouraged them to reach out because we only operate on invitation to Lutheran Disaster Response, and be very clear, we're in relationships, so we are actively communicating with that community that serves those experiencing houselessness. But we want to encourage anyone listening to this podcast within the Lutheran community to please reach out to Building Resilient Community and Lutheran Disaster Response. If you're experiencing a sudden inventory issue or your food pantry isn't able to meet its needs, LDR should hear. These are the way that we can respond as a whole. We have multiple parts of the corpus, and there's a reason why Lutherans built a multi-leg, multi-armed body so that we could respond in different ways. If your community is experiencing worshipers who can't leave their house, if your community's food pantry is running empty, and whether that's because of government policy, or that's because some disaster is struck, or it's a combination of that or any other government policy, Lutherans created the ability to respond, and we will find a way. You created this institutional support, and we are going to use it to the best of our ability to respond as fluidly and aptly as we can.
Susannah, what is Building Resilient Communities, both through LDR and World Hunger? What is the plan to support congregations, synods, and rostered leaders through the end of this year and maybe through the winter?
Yeah, I wanted to share, I think as someone who sits in the pews, churchwide sometimes felt like a mystery, like a black box, and getting in to this part of the organization, getting into this part of churchwide has given me a little bit of an understanding of how the World Hunger works versus Lutheran Disaster Response and Amparo, all of which is housed under Building Resilient Communities. Not only is the giving to World Hunger and congregations' commitment to World Hunger illustrious, extraordinary, the commitment at the congregational level is unmitigated. Even as churches close, the level of giving to World Hunger is very clear. There is a calling towards this. that being said, because world hunger has for so long been and part of the institution of trying to combat poverty and trying to respond to community needs, it makes commitments a year out. So world hunger makes its commitments for the next year, which means that of all of the programs within building resilient communities, it's most tied up and maybe the least able to respond really quickly. But we're trying to do work internally to see if there's ways that we can pivot. Are there means by which that we can pivot to try to respond to what we're hearing? So we've had a number of different partners reach out in which congregations that have served in either immigrant communities or predominantly immigrant themselves have worshipers who are unable to leave their house. They're terrified because of ICE enforcement. And that is not simply folks who don't have status. It can be a household where it's a mixed status household, or they have status, but the stories around picking up people, even people with work visas or lawful residency, or even the stories of some citizens being deported is terrifying to communities. And I'll just lead you back into images you might have seen in the Central Coast of raids, ICE raids happening while people were in the middle of a workday in fields. In those same places where you have seen footage of ICE vehicles, trucks racing through fields or down fields and rows and people running the other way, those same communities have worshipers who are not leaving their homes. And again, not necessarily because they don't have status. And that spectrum of experience or status, all experiencing fear, tells me what I need to know, which is how do we move to try to respond to help? So we have congregations who worship in those areas and who are delivering food boxes to communities who are unable to leave their home to worship, to work, for their kids to go to school. I can barely imagine what that is like. And what I can imagine makes me want to respond, makes my team want to respond. So we're trying to see if we can move things around to create funds to be able to respond. And I'll just say, if you're hearing this and you have a congregation that is experiencing this, please reach out to Mary Campbell and Amparo. Please reach out to me at Building Resilient Communities. We'd love to figure out ways that we can grant a small amount of money, small grants that exist right now to respond. But we're also trying to move things around to be able to respond in the coming months and year. We've also seen similar responses in Kansas. We've heard stories in Chicago. So I think what we are hearing from communities, we are more likely to hear additional appeals. And we were able to move a small amount of unspent money this year to respond to a few of these, and we would like to do more.
Susannah, why do Lutherans care about this?
The reasons that Lutherans care about this is guided by the face of everyone you see is the face of God. We are called to care for our siblings in Christ. I also, when anyone ever repeats the biblical verse, I was once a stranger in the land of Egypt and you welcomed me. The way I came to the ELCA was I was a stranger in the land of Egypt. I lived in Cairo, Egypt, and I worked for a refugee ministry called St. Andrew's Refugee Service. And I worked there 3 different times, in 2004 as a volunteer, in 2005 as a volunteer, and a staff member from 2008 to 2011, and then a board member for about a year. And during that time, if you think of 2011 and 2012, there was an uprising. It's called the Arab Spring. And my neighbors created a watch at the end of both sides of my street, the entrance to both sides of the street during the revolution. While there were no police, while there was no law enforcement, the government had functionally collapsed. And they watched over everyone in the neighborhood 24 hours. You'd go and deliver them tea and food. I lived there. I lived a happy life. I was literally a stranger in the land of Egypt, and they welcomed me. Whenever anyone says this, I think about the layers upon layers on which we depend on welcome, on which we can depend on common care and belonging, that I am yours and you are mine. I think this is why we're called to it. And when you see someone starving, but you have plenty, you're not rich. You are poor when your neighbor starves. You are poor when your neighbor dies of a preventable disease. I think we all are aware that we want to decrease human suffering, and the inspired leaders that created world hunger, if you read these founding documents, they are genuinely inspired. When they made world hunger, when they created it, and they've affirmed it 5, 6 times since its original charter and founding documents, of the 5 objectives, one is to respond in service and relief. The other is to get to the root causes that create poverty. The next is to educate on the root causes that cause poverty. And when I say get to, it means to advocate, to try to get at them and to change them. And then the fourth is to how do we fiscally steward our own resources, how to fiscally steward the church's resources to what is now called CSR, but then didn't have that name. And the fifth is how to listen to people who experience hunger, poverty, and those who are trying to combat it. That's in the late 1970s that this charter was originally founded, and they've affirmed it over and over again. That today is still inspired. And I think we're trying to understand not just that people experience hunger, but why and how.
To reinforce what we can do now, here's a member of the ELCA advocacy staff.
Good afternoon. My name is Andrew Fuller, and I am the Program Director for Economic Policy in the DC-based Witness and Society office. And I also help collaborate with our other policy directors who work on domestic programs. I wanted to share that to take action on some of the items that you heard today, we have a current action alert that goes out to members of Congress that will help encourage them to reach out to USDA, the Department of Agriculture, and other officials to, in part, release the sealed SNAP funding that is used for emergencies and contingencies like moments like this. We can also encourage folks to also end the government shutdown. That would help address a lot of these hunger programs and get regular order back online, and also really highlight the need of other programs that are running low on funding, including the Women's, Infants, and Children program, free and reduced school meals, and other essential hunger programs that are vital. The role of the church is really essential in day-to-day hunger activities, but we can't care for these wider policy issues that stretch across the country. In good partnership between faith-based and public service, oftentimes churches serve people who fall through the cracks of the regular public infrastructure system, people who fail to meet requirements or are basically left on the margins. Oftentimes, this is really good in a relationship between public partners because there are people who fall through the cracks, but we can't care for the entire country on our own. So making sure that our systems and our structures are meeting the needs and following good partnerships that sort of make sure that no one goes hungry is very vital moving forward. In addition to our action alert, I would also encourage you to check in with your local food bank, see if there's ways to partner and collaborate, because many of them might be struggling during this time as many people are looking for food and places to address their needs. And finally, I'll just say that this is really essential on the human level. I'm hearing stories from congregations across the country that are explaining that daycare colleagues, everyday workers, people who are struggling to feed their children are all very, very stressed and dreading what this will mean for their families, even on a temporary basis. There already often is food shortages in many of these communities, even without the shutdown. And people rely on day-to-day programs. In many cases, some people might be caught off guard if they go to a store, try to pay with their EBT card, and they find that their balance is zero. We really need to make sure that these issues do not come to the fore for the sake of many of the most vulnerable among us. So I encourage you to take action over the next few days and make sure that the worst harms are not seen through. Thank you.
This concludes this episode of Here I Pod. If you enjoyed the show, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts, subscribe on your favorite podcast app or over on YouTube, and let a fellow advocate know about the show. If you want to contact us, you can email us over at elcaadvocacypodcast@elca.org or leave a voicemail at 866-740-3522. Thank you for listening.